Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we celebrate Black History Month here at the National WWII Museum. Our classroom webinar today is focusing on the Port Chicago disaster. We're going to be learning a lot about what happened at Port Chicago, what Port Chicago was, and then what followed, and how that relates to kind of the civil rights movement. And so this is our topic for today, is the Port Chicago disaster. If you want to use this later on, we are recording it and it will be posted to our museum website, as well as you'll get a link after this to view on demand. But thank you guys so much for joining us, and I'll go ahead and get started. So some stuff that we're going to be looking at today, a little order of the day prepared for you all. We're going to first start off with before the Port Chicago disaster happens, and actually before World War II officially starts, just with a little bit of background information to kind of get us better situated in understanding what's happening during World War II and what's affecting African Americans. After that, we're going to get into just what Port Chicago was. I know when I first heard about this, I thought it was in Chicago. That's not the case. We'll get into that in a second. After that, we're going to go into the explosion, so what happened at Port Chicago with this. After, we're going to look at these very brave men who stood up to refuse to go back to work or didn't want to return to loading ammunition. Kind of all of that ensues. After, we'll look at the mutiny trial that will happen. And finally, the impact and kind of what that more means for us today. So to start us off with a little bit of the pre-World War II era, we're going to look at a topic that a lot of students learn about in history. Unfortunately, a very hard topic to learn about in American history, and that is segregation. So the Jim Crow laws, which were state and local laws, would mandate segregation in all public facilities, especially in the South. Being here at the National WWII Museum in Louisiana, Louisiana was a state that was heavily affected by segregation. There was segregation in all public facilities, really, as you see here, beginning in the late 19th century into the the early 20th century, roughly about 1870s lasting until 1965. There's segregated schools, segregated drinking fountains, and here in Louisiana we learn a lot about the case Plessy versus Ferguson. That's that case that kind of brought out the term or the phrase separate but equal. There's separate facilities provided for people of color, most notably African Americans, segregated schools, drinking fountains like this photo, but things aren't really equal. So it's important to remember or to learn really about segregation when learning about World War II, because World War II falls right within that time frame, starting in the 1940s, 1941 for the United States. So African Americans, as well as many other minority groups, are living with segregation impacting their everyday lives when World War II comes around. And it's also going to impact how they serve our country during the war. So since Port Chicago was a naval port or a naval munitions place, we're really just going to focus on how segregation affected our Navy members. So looking at segregation in the Navy, there was segregation in the armed forces where there were separate units for African Americans as well as other minority groups separate from white Americans. In the Navy, they usually had white officers kind of over these groups in the Navy. So there was segregation, there was different policies in place. And we see really at the beginning of World War II, there weren't very many African Americans in the Navy at all. Roughly before 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor, there was only about 5,000 African Americans that served in the Navy, mostly all of them as mess attendants. This man, pictured here on the slide, is Dory Miller. Dory Miller may be one of the most famous African Americans to serve in the Navy during World War II. He was a mess attendant and served on board the USS West Virginia. Being a mess attendant, Dory Miller, his job was to kind of work in the cafeteria on board the ship or the place where they all ate. He also would collect laundry and kind of do jobs around the ship to help improve the sailors' everyday lives. He was never trained to operate a weapon, never really trained to fight in active combat, but Dory Miller is going to end up using a weapon during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Whenever the attack happens, he bravely will man an anti-aircraft battery magazine, even though, again, had never been trained to operate that weapon, and is able to shoot down at least one, possibly two Japanese aircrafts before he's ordered to abandon the sinking ship he's on. Dory Miller becomes a hero, really proving to the United States that African Americans can fight for our country. After Pearl Harbor, we see a lot of African Americans are going to join different military branches, but still really kind of in the Navy be regulated to these support roles. Prior to, we see the entrance into World War II, the War Department claimed that the policy with the segregation in the Navy, with really only having African Americans do support roles, had proven satisfactory for a long period of years. But things are really going to change. In April of 1942, there is going to be a policy shift, allowing for African Americans to be accepted into the Navy into general service. Black men could train as sailors, but they would be limited to lower ranks, so they couldn't really be promoted to officers at this time. If they were serving on ships, they'd still have to serve as mess attendants, but in other roles, they could be trained to fight in active combat and do other kinds of jobs. So this is a big shift in April of 1942. We're going to see some other big shifts come, as you can see here on the slide, in March of 1944 with the Golden 13. This is when the Navy will allow for African Americans to start training as officers, marking the very first, the Golden 13. There'll be 13 of them. And so this happens again in 1944. By 1944, there's around 100,000 black sailors. So this is a very big moment, having 13 of them be allowed to be trained and become officers. Another big step is going to be for African American women. The Navy is going to create a women's auxiliary unit as well, so a place for women to serve in the Navy called the WWIIs, the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Services. The WWIIs begin in 1942, but at the end of 1944, African American women will finally be allowed to join the WWIIs. So we'll see at the end of World War II, around 165,000 African Americans serve our country in the Navy. We're just going to be highlighting some of those people who served, those who served at Port Chicago, and really what happened to them there. So let's officially get into, now that we have that background information, what our topic is really about. These African American sailors that stood up at Port Chicago and made a difference really in our civil rights today. Just a few pictures of some different African American sailors, men and women. These are not specifically the ones from Port Chicago. But at Port Chicago, it was a naval magazine located in Northern California, so not actually in the state of Chicago, and it was a munitions depot. There, sailors' jobs were to load ammunition or bombs onto ships that were docked there. Every day, they would go to work onto the piers, hauling munitions off train cars and onto ships. There will be mostly African American sailors in segregated units doing this work, with white commanding officers overseeing them. By July of 1944, it was estimated that there was around 1,431 African American sailors located there, really kind of overseen by those 71 white officers. It's important to note, these men, their job was to handle explosives, handling bombs that were going onto ships, getting ready to be sent out to the Pacific Theater. But they were never trained to do any of this. Very dangerous job, very dangerous work, but they were not even given instructions on really how to do it. Many of the white commanding officers at Port Chicago were not really pleased with the personnel that the Navy had sent to load these munitions, including a captain named Nelson Goss, who believed that minorities could only do about 60% as much work as white men could do. Many of the men that were at Port Chicago, these African American sailors, with this loading of ammunition were worried. They had not been trained to do this, and one of those guys, was Joe Small. Through a series of interviews that was conducted by a historian, we have a lot of record of these Port Chicago men talking about their experiences. Joe Small, said he was never trained to handle the ammunition. If he had been taught how to, he would have felt more comfortable, but he was worried that these torpedoes, these bombs, these incendiary things would go off. The first time he had actually even seen one was when he first started working at Port Chicago. Before that, didn't have any training. The white officers had been given a brief course, but the black sailors didn't, not even a manual. The only kind of safety regulations they had were sheets posted at the work sites, but not at their barracks, so they didn't really have time to read them. Seeing here a photo of what kind of that job looked like for them. So getting more into what their role was at Port Chicago, they were in charge of loading these munitions onto the ship. They faced these working conditions without any training, but the actual job was they would wake up around 6:45 in the morning, march onto the pier, and once they got there, their unit would be divided into 5 groups, roughly about 20 men per group, and each be given a different hatch on the ship to load ammunition into. Each ship had 5 hatches, hence the 5 groups. Their pier that would then bring the ammunition down to be loaded onto the ship was connected to a train track. So the boxcars would have ammunition on them, go down to the end of the pier to get ready to be loaded onto the ship, and it would roll right up to it. The men would then climb into the ship and have a few outside of it to then use planks to lower the ammunition closer to the ship. And they even hung mattresses on the sides of the boat to cushion the blow in case when the boxcar came down the railroad tracks, it came too fast and could hit the ship. So some very not so good working conditions, some kind of weird things going on. And in fact, Percy Robinson, who was one of these African American sailors, would remember hearing this happen all day, having these boxcars come and hit the side of a ship, and he'd say, almost get a heart attack from it. He'd ask the officers if it was possible with all of this kind of happening, all of this danger, this train cars hitting the sides of ships, if a bomb could go off, and the officer said that there really wasn't any danger. So once the munitions were then kind of down towards the ship, they've offloaded it. As you can see here, kind of below these boxes, they'd put it on top of a cargo net. The cargo net would then be lifted up and then brought kind of closer onto the ship so that they could load them. So this was kind of their day-to-day task, loading these munitions, but kind of living in fear that they could go off. It's a very loud work environment. The scene was very stressful, chaotic. There's bombs rolling and hitting each other. And again, like I had said, they had not been trained. This is scary. This is a very scary condition for these guys, but they're still doing this job regardless. In April of 1944, Captain Merrill Keene would take over command at Port Chicago. His job was to make sure that that cargo kept moving as quickly as possible, but he would come into this job with prejudice towards many of the African American sailors. He would say that he never thought it was possible to maintain a satisfactory loading rate with the type of enlisted personnel there. His solution to this loading rate, thinking it was a little too slow, to up the ante to get it to go a little faster, he would post daily amounts of cargo moved by each division. So kind of like a sort of lineup of, who loaded the most, the fastest, and in a way, make it a competition. So this would, he'd hope, inspire divisions to load quicker, to kind of be the top division, but for the sailors, this added a lot of pressure to them. On top of that, it was reported that a lot of the officers would start to bet on their divisions. Who could load the most, $5 here and there. And so this betting would up that ante and really up the pressure for the soldiers who were already scared of loading this ammunition. And again, not having any really safety guidelines or training. Some of the sailors would in fact reach out to the Navy to try to get some training to come to Port Chicago to kind of give them better guidelines, but ultimately that would never happen. The competition, the betting, it bothered the sailors even more. having these dangerous working conditions and now feeling like they were singled out. By July of 1944, I had said earlier, it's estimated that by that point there was 1,431 African American sailors stationed here at Port Chicago, with 71 white officers kind of over them. The Navy would report that there was no discrimination or unusual treatment towards these African American men, but the naval leaders were ignoring the fact that segregation itself, having these men serve in segregated units, was discrimination. And these men should be allowed to physically fight in the war, too. So, I've talked a lot. I'm sure that you've heard my voice a good bit, but we're going to now check out a video to learn a little more about Port Chicago. This video comes from one of our past electronic field trips and was actually filmed on site back in 2018 or 19 with a student reporter and a park ranger, Kelly English, there. They're going to talk to us more about Port Chicago and kind of the setup and see what the site looks like today. So let's check out that video.
I'm at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial in the San Francisco Bay Area. This site commemorates the 320 lives that were lost in the largest munitions explosion in U.S. naval history. It was the worst disaster to happen here at the home front during World War II. Let's go check out the memorial to understand what happened here on that tragic day in 1944. On July 17, 1944, Navy sailors were loading explosives and ammunition into ships right at this port. When a massive explosion occurred at 10:18 p.m., it created a fireball approximately 3 miles across and was felt over 450 miles away. Most of the 320 deaths were black sailors who were never trained on how to properly load ammunition and were pressured by their commanding officers to load these dangerous munitions as quickly as possible. Let's talk with Kelly English, who was the National Park Service Ranger here at the site, to find out what happened next. Hi, Ranger Kelly. Thanks for joining us today. Could you tell me what type of work was going on here at Port Chicago during the war?
Absolutely. Here at Port Chicago during the war, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy had identified that they needed a place that had deep water to be able to load munitions. And munitions are all those huge bombs and missiles and warheads that they would use during the war. And there are only a few locations along the West Coast that had water that was deep enough to be able to have these huge ships come in and be loaded with all of these munitions. And so they were already building a facility here at Port Chicago, which was called Port Chicago Naval Magazine. And this was the main place where munitions were loaded to go out to what we call the Pacific Theater during the war.
Who was working here and what were they doing?
Here at Port Chicago, many African American sailors who signed up to work with the Navy were assigned here to help load munitions. And the work of loading munitions was extremely dirty and it was extremely dangerous because these are huge bombs and explosives and warheads, and it was a really dangerous sort of work. And essentially you had a situation where you had almost an exclusively African American crew of sailors who were doing the most dangerous job in the Navy, stateside at least. And it was a really very segregated situation in that it was the African American sailors who were assigned to do the dirtiest, most dangerous work. And that was pretty consistent with military practices at the time. Along with segregating like that comes a hierarchy of who is considered to be more important and, in this case, more expendable. Or in the sense that if an accident happened with loading munitions, well, at least it was only the black sailors that we lost. And it's very hard for us to understand that today, in today's world, but that really was the world that existed back then in the 1940s. And I should add, too, that this was in the middle of this huge mobilization for trying to get all of these munitions out to the troops overseas as fast as possible. And so the white officers would even have races with each other. Like they were racing to try to see whose unit could load the most munitions the fastest. They were racing, here at Port Chicago, they were racing with some of the other operations in the Bay Area, like at Mare Island and in other loading areas across the Bay. And so they were not paying any attention whatsoever to safety practices.
What were the conditions like at work?
Well, it was pretty hot. As you can see today, it's a very hot day, or at least there would have been many hot days out here. And so it was hot, they were sweaty, they were working long hours. It would have been pretty laborious. A lot of the things that they were moving and lifting were really heavy. And again, they were moving around this really heavy, dangerous stuff. So they had to try to move slowly and be careful, but they worked long hours out in the heat, and it had to have been pretty miserable, I would say. So it would have been really challenging, I think, for them. And it is to their credit that so many of them were so dedicated to their country that they accepted these conditions and worked, and their main focus was on what they could do to aid the war effort, despite all of these indignities that they had to endure on a daily basis.
What happened the night of the explosion? Were there any survivors?
Well, there are many things that we do know about the night of the explosion, but there are some things that we don't know and will never know. What we do know is that at approximately 10:18 on the night of the explosion, which was July 17th, 1944, there were two explosions that happened. The first one explosion happened, and then a larger one about 7 seconds later. We don't know exactly what caused those explosions. We do know that the end result was that the pier area here at Port Chicago was more or less obliterated. There were two ships at the time, the SS E.A. Bryan and the SS Quinault Victory, and they were side by side being loaded. One was almost fully loaded, and the other one had just arrived and was in the process of being loaded. So when the explosion occurred, it was huge. The entire area shook. Windows were shattered as far away as San Francisco. People were shaken out of bed. The town of Port Chicago, which was nearby, was heavily damaged. And it produced this massive cloud that extended about 12,000 feet up into the air. This was a massive explosive event that shook and registered the entire area. And no one knew what was happening at first. I think everyone thought that we might have been under attack. But in fact, we were not under attack. It was just that something had happened at the base with the munitions, and both of those ships and thousands of tons of explosives and 320 men had been blasted away.
So the explosion, just like Kelly English said, would occur at around 10:18 p.m. on July 17th, 1944, with two explosions happening. First a small one, and then a larger one that followed. The investigation couldn't really kind of bring up too much because, as you saw from there, the wreckage that was left behind didn't really leave anything. Many people assumed that the first explosion caused then the large one. But the Port Chicago disaster would become really the largest, deadliest home front disaster of World War II. Like she said, 320 people were killed. 202 of them were African Americans, and hundreds more were injured. Many of the men who were in the barracks who worked the day shift injured in this attack we saw windows in that kind of video, blown out. And the blast was so huge it was felt towns away. In fact, in Berkeley, California, which is roughly about 30 miles away from the blast, it was picked up on their seismograph, so something that measures earthquake, to register as a small earthquake. It was a huge explosion and left behind a lot of destruction. Admiral Carleton Wright, one of the Navy's top officials on the West Coast, would speak on the contributions made by the men that were lost during this explosion, saying that their sacrifice could not have been greater had it occurred on the battlefield. A lot of destruction, of course, left behind, trying to piece together back then what had happened. Even still today, there are efforts to try to figure out what happened at Port Chicago or to try to identify pieces of fragments that had been left behind. Recently, here at the National WWII Museum, we had an exhibit on the Double Victory campaign that featured artifacts from Port Chicago. Interestingly enough, one of those artifacts was a piece of kind of shrapnel, a piece of something from the explosion that initially wasn't really identified. But with the work of our curators here at the National WWII Museum, they were able to figure out what that was. So we're going to check out some artifacts from Port Chicago in a video of one of our museum curators, Corey Graff. He's going to show us something that we identified, as well as some other pieces or another artifact from the Port Chicago 50. So let's listen to Corey Graff and see some artifacts from Port Chicago.
Hi, I'm Corey Graff, one of the curators here at the National WWII Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. And today we're going to be looking at some materials on loan from the Vallejo Historical and Naval Museum. They reveal a grim chapter in America's World War II history. Port Chicago, which is in the California Bay Area, was a naval magazine. What they did was load ammunition that was destined for the war in the Pacific. Often during World War II, black soldiers and sailors were relegated to less glamorous, supportive roles. Things like grave registration, construction, supply, and trucking. All the dirty and dangerous jobs that help a military win the war. And things were no different at Port Chicago. Ships being loaded with ammunition exploded on July 17th, 1944, and it took 320 sailors' lives, a majority of them African American. The explosion was massive. It nearly vaporized 2 ships, a train, and many pieces of the pier. This mangled and burned piece of metal was actually found 12 miles away in downtown Vallejo, California. No one was quite sure what this was, whether it was a piece of one of the ships or some of the ammunition that was being loaded on. Some speculated that it was actually a piece of a mortar shell destined for the Pacific. We actually dove into our collection because we noticed this distinctive fuse on the back of this twisted piece of metal. And we were able to find this. This is the rear end of a 5-inch shell that was used like on destroyers and cruisers and battleships during the war. And we were able to match up that distinctive fuse on both of these and determine that this fragment is actually a piece of ammunition from one of the ships. Seaman Second Class Freddie Meeks was one of the men who survived that day. This is his undressed jumper from World War II. He refused to go back to work under those exact same conditions. In fact, all in all, there were 258 men who refused to go back to work at the magazine, loading that same ammunition that was so dangerous. After punishment and threats, about 208 of those men went back to work. 50 did not. They were charged with mutiny and sentenced to 15 years of confinement and a demotion and forfeiture of pay. Meeks was one of those men, and the conviction led to years and years of hardship for him and his family. It was 1999 before Meeks was offered a pardon. At the time, he was one of the only surviving members of the Port Chicago explosion. It was 2024 before the Navy officially exonerated all 258 sailors.
All right, so we're going to get into more of what Corey was kind of talking about at the end there, and even learn a little more about Freddie Meeks, whose uniform that was. But we're going to now get into the aftermath of the explosion. Of course, after the explosion happened, there was an investigation that took place. An investigation to try to bring up the issues of how the explosions were being handled, the lack of training that these guys had, and the competition that was going on with the loading times there. The Navy would investigate, and in its findings believed that the competition played no part in the increase of the hazardous conditions. In the Navy's report, it stated that the consensus of the opinions of the witnesses, which were white officers, was that the African American sailors were neither temporarily or intellectually capable of handling high explosives, and that there was rough and careless handling of the explosives at Port Chicago, essentially blaming the African American soldiers, saying that they weren't really capable of doing this, but it was the work that the Navy had assigned them to do. After the cleanup had happened, an investigation through Congress was even considered, or Congress would even get involved. There will be a bill that will be brought through Congress to try to compensate the victims that were at Port Chicago that day of about $5,000 to their next of kin, to their family. But one of the congressmen from Mississippi, House Member John Rankin, would object to this bill on the grounds that many of those families that were receiving the money would be Black. Congress would reduce the maximum kind of compensation to these people to about $3,000. That being the maximum, they could receive even less than that. So in this aftermath, along with kind of all these real formal proceedings, we also have the aftermath of the mental sort of state of these men that witnessed it and were affected by it. Many of these men were just sleeping in their bunks, really nearby, and experienced the shock firsthand. People would get injured by the glass coming in, and many of these men were scared, of course. I mean, a huge explosion just happened. With this, they were worried that it might happen again. Many of them would be relocated to a different munition depot to await orders to see, are they going to go back to loading munitions after this? Well, during this time, when they've moved to a new location, there will be a list that'll circulate through their barracks. And the list was kind of a petition of men saying they're not going to return to loading munitions, that they would do any other tasks that the Navy assigned them. However, they were not going to go back to this dangerous work. The Navy believed that this list was a list of people who intended to refuse any order from the Navy, to refuse to handle that ammunition. But the list was actually destroyed. It disappeared. They didn't know what happened to it. The list is going to be a big piece of evidence that's brought up in the trial that'll follow. We'll talk about in a little bit. But we're going to watch a second half of the video on the Port Chicago from the electronic field trip to kind of see more of the aftermath and get us started with talking about the mutiny trial and what's going to happen when these men refuse or don't want to go back to loading munitions. So we'll check out, this is going to be our last video, and then we'll look more into the aftermath.
Only weeks after the explosion, the witnesses and survivors were all sent back to work, back to the same dangerous job of loading ammunition with no regard for safety or military protocols. As the men were in formation to head down to the pier, some hesitated and stopped when they received the order. So, what happened to those who refused to load explosives?
Everyone who survived was severely traumatized because they were involved in the cleanup of this area. And so there were remains of some of the deceased that they had to clean up. And it was very traumatic for those who survived. They had what we like to call survivor's guilt, because many of them lost so many friends. And the white sailors were given sick leave and allowed to take time off to try to recover mentally from this event. But the black sailors, after a very brief period during which they were involved in cleanup, were ordered back to work much more quickly. And so on August 9th, barely 3 weeks or so after the explosion, some of the black sailors who survived had been reassigned to Mare Island, and they were given the order to return to loading munitions. That same dangerous job that had gotten so many of their friends and crewmates killed just a few weeks earlier. And they stopped, and they refused to go back to work loading those munitions. And they were threatened with being charged with mutiny if they continued to refuse to go back to work. So this was kind of a work stoppage, essentially. And at that time, when threatened with mutiny, 208 of them reconsidered and went back to work. And then 50 more still refused to proceed with loading munitions. And so those 50 were arrested, and they were then a few months later charged and tried with mutiny in the largest group mutiny trial ever in U.S. naval history. And they were convicted.
What is mutiny, and what was the verdict of the trial?
So mutiny is generally considered to be an act of rebellion against authority. If you are in the military and you are refusing to follow orders and you are rebelling against authority, that is what is considered mutiny. Now, mutiny also can be very narrowly defined as something as simple as, again, refusing to follow an order.
We're here at a special event. What makes this event so important?
Every year here at the park, we hold an event commemorating the anniversary of the explosion and honoring the life and the lives and sacrifices and the legacy of Port Chicago. to commemorate the explosion and to make sure that those men who did lose their lives will not be forgotten, and that the result of the mutiny trial and the history that was made as a result in terms of desegregating the armed forces, that history will not be forgotten, and that we can continue to learn from that history and from those stories. And so it's a very special time for us to just reflect on what happened here and on the meaning of it, and to reflect on our own personal connection with the memorial and keeping the memory of those lost souls alive by doing so.
All right. So to go a little deeper into what Kelly English just told us in that clip, we'll see that the Port Chicago men will receive their orders to return to work on August 9th, 1945. The sailors would be kind of marched down to the pier and approach a fork in the pier. If they were to be ordered to go one way, it was to return to loading ammunition. If they were told to march the other way, it was just going to a routinely day of exercise. But their order will be to turn the way, that is, to load ammunition. The men will stop in their tracks. They would not return to loading this ammunition. Joe Small, one of the most famous members of the Port Chicago 50, would say, "I wasn't trying to shirk work, but to go back under the same conditions, with no improvements, no changes, with the same group of officers that they had." He had come to the conclusion he was not going back to that same work under the same conditions, and that was that. Along with him, 258 of these men, or I guess in total 258, would not return to work under these same conditions. They would then be placed on a barge, tied to the pier, and held there while the Navy tried to figure out what to do with them and try to get them to return to work. These men, they were afraid. They even said, many of them, they would obey any order that the Navy gave, except the order to load ammunition. One of the approaches that the Navy took was a chaplain named Jefferson Flowers would try to get the men to agree to return to loading ammunition by reminding them that other sailors and soldiers faced enemy fire on the front lines, in foxholes, on ships. But one man, an unidentified one in some of the oral histories that many of the Port Chicago men have stated, would call out, "You can fight back in a foxhole, but you cannot fight back here." Anything could happen. They had no control over what would happen with these ammunitions, versus on the front lines, they'd at least have a fighting chance there. We would see over time many pressures from different Navy officers trying to get these men to return to work, and some would end up agreeing. But 258 would not. They would follow any order except the order to handle that ammunition. That is until 3 days later, so 3 days after they were told to load ammunition, Admiral Carleton Wright would speak to them and inform them that disobeying orders was mutiny. Mutinous conduct at the time of war carried a death sentence. So after they were told this, the men were given that option again: return to work or face that mutinous charge. Only 50 would not return to work, would not return to loading after hearing that it could be mutiny. But in hearing this, what exactly is mutiny? Kelly English gave us a little bit of definition, and the men at the time didn't realize that refusing to follow orders would be defined as this. But the Navy defines mutiny as an unlawful opposition or resistance of a superior military officer with a deliberate purpose to usurp, subvert, or override such authority. But is that really mutiny? What these men did? Joe Small, who is pictured here with kind of his full uniform standing at attention, he is pictured on the left, he didn't consider it mutiny. He would say, "We didn't try to take over anything. We didn't try to take command of the base. We didn't try to replace any officers or assume officers' positions. So how could that be mutiny?" Small believed they didn't do that. The Port Chicago men may have resisted an order, but had they really tried to seize power from the officers, which by definition, by the Navy, was kind of what mutiny was? The other man pictured here, you probably saw the photo of him in that video we saw with Corey Graff. That's Freddie Meeks. And I'll talk even more about Freddie Meeks in a little while. So the Port Chicago 50, these 50 men, they're not going to load ammunition, and they're going to be tried for mutiny. The trial will soon follow, and it will be the largest mass trial in the history of the Navy at this point. The trial begins on September 14th, with the lawyers not even really having enough time to meet with all of the accused before the trial. So keep in mind, August 9th is whenever they said they were not going to load ammunition. They're told it's going to be mutiny really on the 11th or the 12th, and then just a little over a month later, they're on trial. With this, the prosecution, so the Navy's sort of kind of lawyers in that way, the ones that are the prosecution, their argument was that there was a conspiracy by these 50 men to not return to work, that this was the mutiny. It was a conspiracy by these guys, and it was pre-planned. The defense, however, their argument was that these men were working not all together, but instead individually decided that they were not going to handle munitions in unsafe working environments, that this was due to fear and not a secret plot, that all of these men really truly feared for their lives, and if they had been given any other order, they would have followed it. During the trial, much of the prosecution's defense was actually hearsay, testimony from white officers claiming they had heard nameless people saying different things. In the case of these 50 men, half of them were just teenagers, really probably not much older than many of these classrooms that are joining us today. Just kids fresh out of high school, if they even had finished high school, many of them left early to join the Navy, now finding themselves on trial in this way. Some of the defendants even had other factors that were not really played or kind of displayed in this. Factors that didn't even allow them to go back to work or to load munitions. Some of these defendants were people like John Dunn. John Dunn had a Navy doctor tell him he wasn't strong enough to handle ammunition because he was only 104 pounds. A doctor said he couldn't do it, but now he's on trial for saying that he didn't want to load ammunition. Julius Dixon, another man, also had a doctor deem him unfit to load, and he wasn't even there on August 9th being told to load munition. Another one, named Ollie Green, had a fractured wrist on his arm, was in a sling, and he couldn't load per doctor's orders. Later, he even said that had he been ordered to load, he would have, but he was never ordered to because he also wasn't there on August 9th. So this trial, we see some people that have external factors that aren't even put into consideration. Doctors clearing them, not telling them that they couldn't load ammunition. But the result of this trial is going to be the same for all 50 of these men. On October 24th, 1944, the trial will conclude with a guilty verdict for all 50. So all of these men will be guilty of mutiny and sentenced accordingly. An important thing to note with this trial is a very influential person in the civil rights movement is Thurgood Marshall. He had some involvement in the Port Chicago trial. When he had heard about the case, he would attend the proceedings, so he actually would attend some of the court hearings, and believed that there was something very wrong in the courtroom. He'd issue a statement to the Navy to open up an investigation into the disaster and the trial, with these unsafe working conditions, and why, at the time of the explosion, every man that had been loading was African American, and to look into this discrimination that was being faced. He'd work, and after the case was over, petition for appeals. He'd work with the NAACP to spread the men's version of events by publishing pamphlets, and thousands of people would sign petitions to try to reopen the case once it was closed. He believed, Thurgood Marshall, that resisting an order was what they were guilty of, not of mutiny. He pointed out that in the case, legally, a lot of the evidence presented was hearsay, and it wouldn't hold up in a court of law. So he tried and tried to get these kind of proceedings overturned, to get this verdict looked at again. But we'll see that doesn't really happen. Naval lawyers will eventually go over the court transcripts, but the mutiny verdict stood for all 50 men. After the case, what became of these 50, of the Port Chicago 50? Well, they, with the case being a guilty verdict, will be sentenced to 15 years of hard labor and a dishonorable discharge from the Navy. They'd be sent to Terminal Island, which was a naval disciplinary barrack where the Navy confined serious offenders. After the war had ended in September of 1945, we'll see that in January of 1946, the men will actually be told in prison on Terminal Island to pack their bags that they were shipping out. A few days later, on January 7th, the Secretary of the Navy's office will release a statement to the public that the Port Chicago 50 were released from prison and would return to active service at sea. So if the Navy really believed that these men were guilty of mutiny, why let them out to sea on board American ships just 16 months later? But they would. They would return to war and finally go overseas and fight for our country, rather than just loading munitions back home. After finishing their service, many of the men would return home, but their discharge, so after completing their service, their discharge would be under honorable conditions, a category of discharge that is given to men who have performed their duty, but the record contains some disciplinary action. This discharge, this under honorable conditions category, made it so that they were eligible for some benefits like health care, but they were not eligible for the GI Bill. For the rest of their lives, this mutiny charge will hang over their heads, really. For many years, people tried to get the Navy to reconsider, and in the late 80s and 90s, many members of Congress would petition for the Navy to reopen this. But they were told it was too late to open up the case. But these men could appeal for a presidential pardon. In 1999, only one of the members of the 50 would apply for that presidential pardon, and that was Freddie Meeks, the man we have his sailor uniform and you've seen many photos of. In 1994, the Navy reviewed the case and would issue its report and found that racial discrimination actually played a part in the assignment of these African American soldiers to load ammunition. However, racial prejudice did not play a part in the court-martial convictions or sentencing. So that court-martial conviction, the mutiny conviction, would stand. More recently, though, we've seen that that's kind of court-martial or the mutiny charge has not held up. In July of 2024, the Navy officially exonerated all of the Port Chicago 50, finally. Really, after 80 years after this event had happened, these men would finally see an overturn in their case. However, the last survivor, which was Freddie Meeks, had passed in 2003, so none of them were still alive to learn of that news. However, we see this big change that has happened in our country really today from what was happening back then. Speaking of changes that have come about, our last thing that I'm going to talk about until we'll look at some questions that people have dropped in chat or dropped in the Q&A function is the impact that it has on civil rights. So the Port Chicago disaster, the Port Chicago 50, the trial, the mutiny charges really had an impact on our lives today through the civil rights movement that followed really World War II. The Port Chicago disaster played a big part in exposing racial injustices in the military, and would even influence the Navy's decision to desegregate the Navy in 1946. It made it the first military branch to officially fully desegregate. This would lead then to, in 1948, President Harry Truman signing Executive Order 9981 that officially desegregated all of the military. It allowed for equal opportunity for all persons without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. And like I had mentioned, the Port Chicago 50 would be officially exonerated on July 17th, 2024. Pictured here are a few of those Port Chicago 50, Freddie Meeks being one of the colored photo in the top that we've talked about, Joe Small being kind of catty-cornered to him in black and white. But these men, again, really were standing up for something that was right, and we can see that impact felt through the civil rights movement and even felt today.